Clemens, the founder and coordinator of the MPC Great Books program. Welcome to MPC and welcome to National Poetry Month. Unfortunately, as T.S. Eliot reminds us, April is the cruelest month, and that is especially true this year, as in the last 2 weeks we have lost both the Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko and our friend, the Caribbean Nobel laureate Derek Walcott. Though their mortal vessels have sailed, their poems abide and will be read so long as men can breathe and eyes can see. I'd like to thank the Apgar Foundation, which has given so much to MPC Great Books and to the Central Coast literary community. In addition, thanks go to Kristen Darkin, who created our poster. I want to thank Amy Converse, Colton Miller, and Bill Easton of the MPC Library, Laura Worley of the MPC Print Shop, and Maria Alcazar of the MPC Bookstore. Back in the corner. And for those of you unaccustomed, I imagine there's some of you who are unaccustomed to poetry readings, the general etiquette is to consider each poem as part of a single unified performance. So please hold your applause until the poet signals the end of this performance. After the reading, there will be a book signing. Please print your name for Robert on the index cards supplied. There's a little stack of index cards. If you print your name, it makes it easier for him to inscribe your book. Now to the reason we have come together here tonight. In our company is one of the finest poets America has ever produced, Robert Hass. As you know, Robert is a celebrated artist, a translator of Basho and Miłosz, a MacArthur Genius, a National Book Award, and Pulitzer Prize winner for Time and Materials, from which he read to us. Maria has copies back there. From which he read to us, can it be 10 years ago? He served 2 terms as Poet Laureate of the United States, but those are just the laurels of society. We scholars and students are concerned with the poems and with the poet in appreciating and honoring his poetic genius. We are not at all concerned with listening anymore to the host. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Hass.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I was saying to David as we were driving over, I grew up in and around San Francisco, Marin County, in the 50s when it was, I thought all real artistic activity was happening in Monterey. So we'd come down here for the jazz festival and then later for the pop festival. And there was a coffee house called, when coffee house seemed like a radical invention by itself, called Sancho Panza's. You remember?
Yeah.
It had shelves full of books, tables where you could read mimeographs of poetry journals from San Francisco. And then there was Cannery Row and remains not only of John Steinbeck, but if you grew up on the coast, Doc Ricketts as well. Anyway, it's wonderful to be in this place. It's still completely romantic for me. Derek Walcott was my friend. A lot of poets died in the last year. About 10 years ago, Eugenie Yevtushenko came to read in Berkeley, and I took him for a hike on Mount Tamalpais, north of San Francisco, to show him, to brag by showing him the spectacular panoply of presentation of wildflowers in April, to show him that's what we Californians did. And we went out, it was incredibly beautiful. He's a tall, rangy, very handsome, nervously energetic guy, and I'd invited a bunch of, ne'er-do-well Bay Area poets and writers to come. There were maybe 8 of us, and we got up on the hillside above Stinson Beach it's shimmering with lupin and poppies, and we broke out our lunches and bottle of wine, and we toasted the Russian and American poets. And he said, looked us over and said, "So which of you is CIA?" Which was a window into that world. You know, that things can get pretty bad here, but so far, we don't live in a place where you don't know which member of the social group you're in is reporting on anything you say to the authorities. So it's something to celebrate. And also remember him, complicated guy. Anyway. But to read, if you've been writing for a long time, so what I usually do is just read news, stuff that I'm still working on, and I'll start there, but and then figure out. One place that poetry begins for me, more as I grow older, is with dream, with just what the unconscious produces. Partly, I'm amazed that it's so tireless. You know, you'd think, I wake up some mornings and you'd think it would have quit by now. You know? Anyway, so this poem is called First Poem because of some idea I have that's what William Yeats says about his poems. They begin where all ladders start, in the, what's the adjective, David? In the something ragged bone shop of the heart. So anyway, from the ragged bone shop of the heart, first poem. In the dream, he was a hawk with blood on its beak. In the dream, he was a hawk. In the dream, he was a woman, naked, indolent from pleasure, a gleam of sperm on her vaginal lips. In the dream, he was that woman. He could both be the woman and see the viscid fluid in the dream. In the dream, he was a turquoise bird fashioned from blue stone by people who dug it from the earth and believed it was the shattered sky of a foreworld. In the dream, he was the turquoise bird. In the dream, his feet hurt. There was a long way still to go, lizards scuttling in the dust. In the dream, his feet hurt. In the dream, he was an old man, his woman gone, who woke early each day and made his pot of coffee and sliced bits of melon for the lizards and set them on the hard ground by the garden wall. In the dream, he was the old man. The calm mouths of the lizards, as they waited, themselves the color of dust, meant that every creature was singular and solitary on the earth. In the dream, the woman in the elevator took out her eye. It was a moon in the dream. In the dream, there was a knock on the door, and it was a troop of begging children, and he said to them in mock outrage, "You scoot, this is not your day, Tuesday is your day." And the children laughed with great good humor. Their day was Tuesday in the dream. So I recommend to you, just keep a bedside notebook and just do the kind of main plot point in your dreams, and you will find out how exhausting and inexhaustible your own unconscious is. I was thinking about the fact that for a while in the 20th century we had a theory of dreams, that Freud, that philosophers had really never taken an interest in it before. And in the 1910s, 1920s, Freud proposed the idea that all our dreams were active expressions of repressed desires. That gave you a way to read dreams. And then Jung, who didn't want them to be so sexual, thought that there was a drive in humans to integrate all of their thoughts, dreams, wishes, and impulses, and that the dream was always an expression of that drive towards psychic wholeness and health, which we don't, in his theory, we're already completely screwed up by the time we're 5 years old. We spend the rest of our life trying to change. I think now, the culture doesn't have a theory of dreaming. Native Californians, I've read in Kroeber's Handbook of California Indians, among the different cultures they had in common the idea that that was another world that you entered into, and that it was a form of politeness to let people know if you dreamed about them that that was where they were last night. In case you're wondering, you were in my dream and you were eating corn, or whatever. Anyway, we don't have one right now. All the more reason for you to be empiricists of your dreams. This is a poem on another subject. I was raised a Catholic, Roman Catholic, and this is a poem about, and all the writing I've read about Roman Catholic childhoods is about mean nuns, and punishment and sexual repression, and the nuns who taught me were angels. So this is for them, Catholics. Pange lingua, we sang, the children dressed in white for First Friday Mass. Actually, we sang Pange lingua with an extra ah at the end to fit the tune, and then we repeated it with the extra syllable in the middle, Pange lingua. The nuns wore white as well, beautifully white linens that fell to their feet, white also around their necks and foreheads, and a black mantle over the tops of their heads, and black rosary beads hanging from belts that cinched their long gowns. The rosaries had 35 beads, cinched together with tiny loops of a silvery metal, and sometimes they would tell us the story of the 35 beads, 10 for each decade of the rosary, one set of 10 for the sorrowful mysteries, the 10 events that told the story of the torture of the good young God, and the joyful mysteries, the stories of his life and how good he was to his Holy Mother, the way he cured the sick and fed the hungry and raised a man up after he died. And then the glorious mysteries, which were how, having died, he became alive again and walked with people in his sandals on a road, and then went to heaven, where he had, also was, they said, a father, and his mother went too after him, floating up when she died. His going was called an ascension, and we celebrated that on Ascension Thursday, when all the classes got to go on a picnic in Sonoma County and swim in cool chlorinated water under willow trees, and where, if you were daring, you could climb the steps of a high board, walk to the end, stare down into the water, summon your courage, and jump. Her going was called Assumption. It happened in August, so there was no holiday, but on Sunday we also dressed in white and sang. The other beads were for the Our Father, beginning of each decade, prayer that took much too long, and one to start the whole thing, and one at the end. The regular beads were Hail Marys, which was what the angel said to the mother with the blue mantle when her belly was round. You said those 10 times, and that was the decade. We also sang Pange Lingua on those summer Sundays. The next verse was Corporis Mysterium, and we sang it, Corporis Mysterium. We didn't see them every day in the summer, the nuns, because we were out of school. In school, besides telling us the story of the beads, they would tell us about our guardian angels, how every human being had one. It was invisible, but it had been sent to take care of every person because they were all precious, whether you thought so or not. And one nun said, when we asked, that in her opinion, every animal also had a guardian angel. But this was summer, we saw the sisters only on Sunday, and because they looked in their habits, their clothes were called habits, like large white birds, you thought of them when you thought of the angels. Pange lingua means eat tongue, and corporis mysterium means the body of the mystery. Eat tongue, the body of the mystery. That was to get us ready for communion, and that was why we fasted in the morning and were very hungry. And because it was summer, we went home and had pancakes and were free to play all through the long afternoons. So that's my homage to my childhood. So we have California landscape in common. When David and I were, he's a little younger than me, but I think you're still a generation of California kids for whom all textbooks were printed in New England or New York. And so the Dick and Jane always went out and they bounced up and down in the fall leaves near Red Barns, and they, like Charlie Brown and Lucy, they put on Pillsbury Doughboys jackets and went out and shoveled snow and stuff like that. So when I finally got to the East, I thought I'd finally in the real world. But I also felt some obligation to register our world and our weather to try to get it into poems. So this is a coast poem, October, Abbott's Lagoon, which is a walk up in West Marin, north of San Francisco, but I'm sure, like a lot of the walks around here, less hot fig up there than down here. Abbott's Lagoon, October. The first thing that is apt to raise your eyes above the dove gray and silvery thickets of lupin and coyote bush and artichoke thistle on the sandy, winding path from the parking lot to the beach at Abbott's Lagoon is the white flash of the marsh hawk's rump as it skims low over the coastal scrub. White-crowned sparrows, loud in the lupin even in October, even in the drizzly rain, startle and disappear as you approach. The bush rabbits freeze, then bolt and disappear, and the burbling songs and clucks of the quail that you may not even have noticed you were noticing go mute, and you were there in October and the rain, and the hawk soars past, first the hawk, then shadow of a hawk, not much shadow in the rain, low sun silvering through clouds a little to the west. It's almost sundown, and this is the new weather at the beginning of the middle of the California fall, when a rain puts an end to the long, sweet days of our September, when the skies are clear, days mild, and the roots of the plants have dripped down into the 5 or 6 month drought and licked all the moisture they are going to lick from the summer fogs. And it's very good to be walking because you can almost hear the earth sigh as it sucks up the rain. Here, where mid-October is the beginning of winter, which is the beginning of a spring greening, as if the sound you were hearing were spring and winter lying down in one another's arms. Under the hawk's shadow, among the coastal scrub, ocean in the distance, and the faintest sound of surf, and few egrets, bright white, working the reeds at the water's edge in October in the rain. So that's our earthly place. So this is another California poem. It didn't occur to me that it had a politics, but it's come to have a politics, actually. And this one is called Christmas in August. And I wrote it because I'd earlier really imitated Gary Snyder. I'd written a poem that had a recipe for onion soup in it. So I got a invitation from the editor of a cooking magazine called Saveur to write a poem with a recipe in it. And I said, I don't do that. I'm a pure artist. I don't write anything for assignment. And I got off the phone feeling morally superior and immediately thought of an idea for a poem with me. So this is called Christmas in August. Towns on the northern California coast. I didn't stop to ask, is the sound okay in the back? Can you hear me? Towns on the northern California coast are foggy in August, with shafts of startled sunlight, sometimes in the afternoon. It's hard to know what season you were in. So in the market this morning, idling past the sacks of corn flour with my cart, a snatch of the lilt of Spanish came into my head. Maria Carmona makes 100 tamales every year for Christmas Eve and likes to talk, when I see her in town on a cold December day, about her schedule. The day she roasts the pork and boils the chickens. The day she spends simmering the mole, onions and garlic, of course, bay leaves and chilies, guajillo or chipotle for smokiness, and oregano. How much, you ask Maria, and she shrugs un poquito. And at this season, sticks of cinnamon, a little ground pumpkin seed, cumin, and some chocolate. Her sister likes green olives. You simmer it for hours while you knead the corn flour with pork fat for the roast and the seasoned water you boil the chickens in. And then Christmas Eve, when the children help you fashion the tamales in their hojas, that was the phrase I remembered in the market, the one about the young girls and their manos rapidos. It made me think of Christmas in the Berkeley Hills. And an old man's hand, a refugee professor from another generation. He would seem chagrined when I saw him in the market, shopping, as if we'd been caught in some unmanly compromise when we should have been home writing treatises on medieval Polish grammarians. He loved preparing herring on Christmas Eve, and I could visualize his old hands, not so quick, slicing pieces of the fatty Baltic fish, assembling juniper berries, the vinegar and peppercorns and olive oil, bay leaves and cloves. There is, I'm sure, some Polish phrase for just the right amount of mustard, meaning just enough. At our house, we peel chestnuts on Christmas Eve morning. My beloved in her apron browning onions and celery for the stuffing, her flowered apron all business, as if she were commanding the ship of the world, which in a way on that day she does. Outside, it was August, planet just turning toward the dark a long way, and not a long way from the short dark days we gather to celebrate the light surviving through. Which puts me in mind of building walls. This is probably a subject I didn't know anything about, but I was in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and I heard birdsong, and got out my Aves de Medicano and identified the birds, and then about a year later, I was in Houston, and I heard the same sound. And this poem comes from that. And it's called Song of the Border Guards. When I sat in the square in Cuernavaca, outside the Church of the Conquistador, wondering if Maninche had ever loved Cortez, and watching the streams of people go by in their white shirts and blouses in the heat and the brightly colored cellophane papers in which small candies are wrapped and unwrapped, being blown about in a slight breeze. What was all that racket in the trees? Boat-tailed grackles and white-winged doves. And in Houston, in the park on a Sunday, among the dragon kites and soccer balls and the families on picnics in the heat, not far from the Chapel of the Sacred Heart where Mark Rothko had made that solemnity of stained glass windows for the suffering God in cardinal red and a sorrowing blue. What was louder than all the transistors, the hip-hop and mariachi? What was that racket in the trees? Ay, 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 ay. Boat-tailed grackles and white-winged doves. And in Waco, in the Riverside Park along the Brazos, where the city fathers might spend a little more money picking up the blown-about wrappers of fast food, even if it would constitute an activity of government and be somewhat illicit, not far from the marker commemorating the founding of the city of Baptist by a Caribbean Jew who arrived from Jamaica on a riverboat, or from the chapel at Baylor, where the words of two English poets are lit by the heat of the spring sun in reds and blues of arts and crafts glass. Even there on that campus, what was that racket in the trees? Boat-tailed grackles and white-winged doves. And in San Antonio, where Louisiana live oaks on the campus of the university are married to red brick in paradise, and along the river that the Cotahuitan people call Yangawana, where the Canary Island Portuguese families settled with inducements by the Spanish crown, so that 200 years later, General Antonio Lopez de Santillana crushed the Yankee insurgents and tax resistors at the old Pueblo of the Alamo, or where, in the other telling, Travis and Bowie and Jim Crockett under the spindly cottonwoods would not be brought to their knees. Cottonwoods by the river, live oaks in the park, two versions of the story who this place belonged to, and what is that racket in the trees? Boat-tailed grackles and white-winged doves. North of there, the air changes a little, and imperceptibly, in this valley or that. So the species of willow along the river changes, and the insects in the leaves change, and the size of the fruit, and the seeds scattered on the lawns of small towns with their statues of soldiers from the various wars are not so large and require different claws or beaks to manage. And you come to a place of mourning doves and Inca doves, where the fluting coos and mute blackbirds with yellow eyes have replaced the grackles. So what is this business of walls and borders? Who owns this country anyway? What is that racket in the trees? Ay, yi, 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 boat-tailed grackles and white-winged doves. So that was to have an excuse once I had the names of those two birds in my head. I'm going to read you a little bit of a weird poem or set of poems that came out of what they were occasioned by. Actually, was two things. One was a beloved nephew of mine, wonderful young guy, businessman in San Francisco, was running in the marathon Gilgate Park in his mid-30s, and he finished the race and fell over and died. My brother's youngest son. And it was that summer, the last time in the year, just before the drought, that when you went into the mountains in the middle of the summer, there was still snow on the mountain peaks. So this is a group of poems. It's called Patches of Snow in July. And there's a little prose beginning to it. In July, there had been weeks of unseasonable cold and several days of snow in the Tahoe Sierra, so that city people were driving up to ski on the 4th of July. 10 days later, the tips of the pines seemed to be on fire with the neon green of new growth, and along the Truckee River, wildflowers had the raw look of early spring, as if they were astonished at themselves for having forced the dead earth, and were only just getting accustomed to sunlight. Driving into the valley, something about the way the grasses and wildflowers and trees climbed the mountain right up to tree line, as if they were a young orchestra hitting high notes, and the way the patches of white snow in the saddles of bare rock between the massive peaks glittered in the sun just undid me, if that's the right word. Undid, woke up. Life in its exuberance seemed to be rushing straight uphill toward death. The night before, I had been reading from an anthology of 17th century English poetry. There was a poem about the infant martyrs by a poet named Richard Crashaw. The beginning of it goes like this. Nor let the milky fonts, it's called, so this poem is, each of these poems then begins with a quotation from one of these Christian poets of the 17th century. Nor let, so this is Richard Crashaw, it was a very delicious and weird poem. Nor let the milky fonts that bathe your thirst be your delay, the place that calls you hence is, at the worst, milk all the way. It's a beautiful, strange poem. So I had set myself the task then of writing a poem called Death in Infancy. Almost as if one should not speak of it, who is not, as a parent, had the shock of it. Too late to tell them that life is a breath, or that life, which is so fair, is so unfair. Too soon to be sure one is not hearing through the wall the last crying before sleep, to know a lullaby from inconsolable lament. Hush now, just begun. Sleep a little, sleep. So what can you do except write a lullaby, right? That got me going. So this is called Death in Childhood. And the epigraph is from a poet named Ben Jonson on the death of one of his children. Beautiful poem, the last line of it, which is, which covered gently, well, which covered lightly gentle earth. He was a solemn and delicate little boy. His father was a physicist, and I could see on the day that I watched him on the beach in La Jolla that the shell in his hand was no toy to him. He had learned to look at things, also to treat information with great seriousness. So he studied the shell carefully and explained to me that the successive ridges on the curvature were the stages of its growth, and what form of carbon calcium was, and how evolution had worked its way up to the invertebrates. He would brush back a shock of blonde hair from his eyes to look up and see if I followed him. The hole in his heart, which was congenital, was not what killed him. It was the way his lungs had to labor because of the defect. The surf was breaking through irises of light, quick, small rainbows down the beach as far as one could see. He had to have been a very avid listener. It seemed to me to mean that he'd been loved and wanted to be like his father, which was why it was so delicious for him to be talking to almost any adult about all there is to know. So this is Death in Adolescence. And it has an epigraph from a wonderful poem by John Donne, and the epigraph is, "We shall new shadows make the other way." On a Tuesday morning, early, on the lawn by the pond, there's a scattering still of red and white rose petals from a Sunday wedding. Slow ripple of wind on the green pond, quick rippling in the aspen leaves. Is there anything that doesn't stand for them in summer? Insects skimming the surface tension of the water, isn't that them? The small circles their legs make on that glass, that's them too. The pert, dusky, insect-eating bird perched on a hunk of gray granite, the kind they call glacial errata, that the reflection of the pond reads back to the sun as a shade of warm, pale brown, almost an umber. The young man in my lecture class always took the same seat halfway up until one morning when he didn't. It was almost the end of the term. His parents wrote to ask to see if I had his final essay. I looked in my tall stack of unread student papers and I found it on Voices Speaking from the Dead in Emily Dickinson. Is there anything they aren't figured by? The thick swarming of insects at the pond's edge that has made the perched bird so alert. Someone who lived into her 30s and studied entomology told me that they swarm that way, the males, because it's efficient. Easier to be noticed en masse if you were a female looking for a mate. And in this one way, at least, they are like high school. The girl who dies of being fat, of not having breasts, of too thick calves or acne. The boy who dies of stuttering, of the distance between his imagination of himself and how he imagines he is seen. These are the children with their backpacks in the morning and a sullen look as if their parents had sent them out to peddle damaged goods. The boy who dies because his roommate films him having sex with another boy and puts it on the internet so that everyone can gather in his mind and giggle as they watch him come and cry out loud, oh, oh, oh. In what form not to pray for their presence still among us? As salt on the tongue, as used candy wrappers on the street, white candles in summer, pumpkin colored in the fall, out, out, brief candle, Macbeth says. I'm skipping a long description of candlesticks, which I think I should cut. Sleek chrome candlesticks of a no-frills modernist design, that's them too. The steam churning window in a washing machine, that's the teenage years, all straightways on highways, all long slow curves on mountain roads, the red glow fading in the tubes of old radio sets when you turn them off, the tinny sound of the recorded voices of disused comedians on old television shows. Say, Molly, why didn't you take the elevator up? Because, and the audience, 1954, 1933, is laughing already. New tennis shoes, old tennis shoes. Arthur Axelrod, you were the old, tall, Gothic arches that the elms made down the settled, handsome neighborhoods in Buffalo, New York, before elm disease took them. And you were the active spores of elm disease and the huge Morris Lewis canvas of color disappearing in the abstract expressionist galleries of the Albright Knox Museum. It was my first job. The English department was at Quonset, and the department was full of poets. There must have been a dozen poets, and a precocious high school boy came after school and wandered in the halls. I used to write like Robert Greeley, he would say. Basil Bunting got his meter from the music of Scarlatti, he would say. A pink-faced boy, plump, as if from a mild deficit in testosterone. I can't seem to finish my elegy for Charles Olson, he said, and the people in the department joked about this precocious child until one day he wasn't there. Winter can stand for them. Spring, of course. Even fall in certain turbulent or reluctant or tender stages of its changing. What doesn't stand for them is what's old, worn down, used up. Though what's old and skilled, the skills almost unconsciously absorbed, may be a place to stand to see the death of teenage kids. Not the point of view of a young actor whose agent calls before the interview to remind him not to comb his hair. The old actor who goes off in a tweed hat and bow tie, plaid shirt in the morning to do the insurance company commercial before his teeth cleaning appointment, before his lunch with his stepdaughter to try to straighten out their misunderstanding on the phone, before he arrives at the theater and does his stretches and takes a lozenge for the throat. He's going to do King Lear before he begins his makeup that will run with sweat some 5 hours later when he hurls himself on stage, holding his daughter in his arms and howling, never, 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 never. Most famous line by Epic Pentameter in Shakespeare, which I cheated by stealing. So, I'll read one more of these. You can imagine what I did. Oh my God, now people. Actually, how many of you are in your 20s here? Okay, for those who die in their 20s. I say I found myself looking at actuarial charts, and in one part of my mind I intend to put them in. What people, for example, the deaths in infancy across cultures that are probably attributable to accident and neglect are 0.05, You think about it, we're the only mammal species that, I mean, if you have a human baby, you basically can't take your eye off it for 7 years, 5 years. In most cultures, then an 8-year-old can keep an eye on the but really, so, and that it turns out we're really terrific at taking care of infants. That humans don't make that mistake very much. And all they have going for them is big eyes and cry and smile, anyway, it's an amazing thing about evolution. Main cause of death of teenagers in all developed countries is suicide. Next, driving too fast on the road. So if the teenagers here, it gets better. And don't drink and drive. So now this is my lecture to you in your 20s. Joe was the first person I knew who cultivated languid boredom as a mark of his superior intelligence. Like the characters I read about in English novels, he was handsome, brilliant, gay, which you knew about him immediately and did not normally know about people immediately in those days. His grandfather owned factories in Cincinnati. It was said in the New Yorkers, I was getting to know, teased him for referring to himself in California as an Easterner. As if in this one way, this person whose style was acid frankness had fudged his vita to disown the ordinary Middle West. We told him he was rich. Trust fund, not rich, he said. It means I'll be another assistant professor of classics with slightly nicer things than everybody else. The impressive part of which was that while most of us were worried about surviving graduate school at all, or whether it was a fit, and if not, what we were going to do then, Joe had already assumed a success that seemed to him second rate, which in those days, oddly enough, like the clothes he wore so easily, gave him a silvery beauty in our eyes. A beauty that the note he left when he killed himself confirmed. It's Tuesday and overcast. It seems a thing to do. San Gorio Beach. In the 20s, a friend is a world and a style of speaking or dressing, a social class or an ethnicity, a way of walking or thinking, if it shimmers, is almost erotically attractive, partly because it's the age when wealth or beauty or brains or brute force or swinging one's shoulders with a special grace seems like grace. If you leave the world you grew up in, which if it happens to most Americans at that age, there's something in that eros of the other that gives to the desirer or admirer another pair of eyes, sophisticates the world for us just when our appetite for glamour in its various forms is sharpest. And so, terrible as it is in a way to say it, the world we lose when we lose the ones who die in their 20s, not speaking of siblings or lovers or parents, doesn't lose the brilliance of its luster. And even death, because it is terrible, does not taste terrible. Because the first adult grief makes us feel adult. His body, when they recovered it, was shipped home. We meant to speak of him at parties, and what we said to each other, mutely, in the silence of the first exchange of looks, was something like, so this is death, the real deal. And now, whatever it is we're in is not just made up anymore. None of us knew him well enough to know what hurt him into the Pacific. Seems to me now that he probably died of being gay in the wrong decade. Then, I thought that his death had a certain glamour, even though its glamour was despair, which he would have liked my feeling, and probably had imagined, and he shouldn't have. So the last mournful bit of one of these is the plan or dirge from my nephew who died in his 30s. If life is a day, Then 33, there's a green wind on the pond, it's summer on the pond. It's near to an unshadowed noon. It's a green wind on the pond, summer on the pond. Frank O'Hara, Lester Young, summer on the pond. There's a green wind on the pond. Sylvia Plath, Arthur Rimbaud. There's a green wind on the pond, summer on the pond. Our dear Peter at 36, it's summer on the pond. There's a green wind on the pond. His wife was pregnant 7 months. There's a green wind on the pond, summer on the pond. He was running a half marathon. There's a green wind on the pond, green wind on the pond. We threw white roses in the grave. There's a green wind on the pond, summer on the pond, summer on the pond. So I think all the other stuff was kind of a prep for that. So here's something completely different. Okay, this involves audience participation. The title of this poem is "The Six Sheep's Sick." Please say it after me. The six sheep's
Sheep sick.
sheep's sick.
Sheep sick.
The six sheep's
Sick.
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 Praise to the breath and the lips and the teeth. Praise to the tongue and the larynx and the pharynx and the soft palate and the hard palate and the vibration of the vocal cords. Peter Piper picked a peck of seashells at the seashore. Peter Piper picked a peck of seashells at the seashore. She sells rubber baby buggy bumpers. It's early March in California, late afternoon. There's one tiny tufted titmouse in the bare branches of the sycamore just outside my window, the loudest and the smallest of all the spring birds. Its eyes the size of a single black currant. 3 sweet notes, perfectly spaced, and then sometimes 4. It's not too difficult to say one tiny tufted titmouse.
One tiny tufted titmouse.
But requires an increment of effort. And in the bare branches of the sycamore, is pure pleasure. When I read my poems aloud, I find it hard to say that the people stand on tiptoe to pick ripe huckleberries that the deer can't reach. Stand on tiptoe
To pick the right
to pick ripe huckleberries.
that the deer can reach.
Stand on tiptoe to pick ripe huckleberries.
Stand on tiptoe to pick right huckleberries.
Pick ripe huckleberries.
Pick right huckleberries.
Aluminum linoleum. The round leaf buds on the tips of the branches of the sycamore are glowing gold in the afternoon sun. 3 sweet notes again. It wants a mate, maybe. Maybe it's just playing. Researchers have taught chimps over 100 words, and the books say they can't use them to form concepts. She sells pickled peppers.
She sells pickled peppers.
3 notes again, but can't doesn't seem quite right. What if what if it's just not in the range of things a chimp wants to do? I want to say ripe huckleberries.
Right huckleberries.
The titmouse flits from branch to branch
The titmouse flits from branch to branch.
because I want to. Praise to the breath and the teeth and the lips. Praise to the tongue and to the animal who first said pharynx and to the one who first said larynx. Praise. So, yeah, that's enough. Sometimes when you do readings, people say, do you still rhyme in poems? Or they're still rhyming poems? And I say yes. And one of my favorite rhyming poems of all time is the first poem we have of Emily Dickinson's. She wrote it when she was 18 years old in school as a valentine to some boy. And it goes, put down that apple, Adam, and come away with me, and thou shalt have a pippin from off my father's tree. Isn't that a wonderful poem? So I wrote a valentine. We lived in the same town together for some time before we got together. So this is a February song. I used to see her at the track, her streaming hair, her straight back, and she became a thought of mine. St. Valentine, St. Valentine. Soft her lips and drink the wine, her soft lips and drink the wine. St. Valentine, St. Valentine. So thank you very much. So David said maybe 10 minutes of question or conversation if you like. Yes.
I read the column in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the lyrics, that you wrote. Have you ever tried your hand at actually writing lyrics to music?
When I was a kid, I thought I was making up song lyrics in high school, and I haven't really since. Except a couple of times. I taught a class with a composer, and he was writing, making an opera out of Arthur Miller's After the Fall, and the main character of that is an unsuccessful songwriter. So he sent me the job of writing not very good song lyrics for this character, for him to set to think. But it wasn't much of a challenge to me to write not very good song lyrics.
Do you write every day, or do you have a schedule of writing like some writers do? Or?
Yeah, questions do I write every day? I try to put in a little bit of time. One of my mentors was a poet named Denise Levertov, and she wrote an essay in which she said, if you waited for inspiration, you would have no work to do, properly speaking. So, and that idea, you have work to do, properly speaking. I translate, I write a lot of prose, so I often have, and I sometimes think I do that in order to avoid writing poetry. But one way or another, I try to put in a little bit of time every day. I went to graduate school at Stanford, and and I went there because I had heard that the Irish short story writer Frank O'Connor was teaching there, and I thought I wanted to write short stories at that time. He wasn't teaching there anymore, but he came back and gave one talk, and people asked him if he had any tips about writing. And he said, well, I do, I have one. You can't revise nothing. Which is kind of the best advice for writing. The other way of saying it, Denise Levertov saying, show up. The muse may not visit you, but show up. And my experience is that if you wait, it gets harder, not easier. So just kind of put in time every day. When I get really busy and I get really stuck, I keep a journal in which I have a rule that I have to write in it for 5 minutes every day. No more than 5 minutes, but 5 minutes. When I think I have no time for anything, and then it turns out that if you write something that interests you, you make time. But I think for all writers, the thing to do, and it's never too late to start writing. One of the things about the history of literature is that people have written some of the great novels and some of the great poems at every stage in life. And some people have not started writing until their 40s, 50s, 60s, and done beautiful work that, is a comfort to other people and a power in that way. So wherever you are in relation to writing, the way to do it is to do it. Other version of this, someone asked Walker what it took to be a writer, he said pencil.
Speaking of revision, Donald Hall told us that he revises his poems hundreds of times.
Yeah.
How do you revise your poems?
This question is revision, that what Donald Hall said, he revises his poems hundreds of times. I'm sure that that's true, and that some of it is you put in a the and you take it out the next day, that kind of writing. I tend to, in that sense, I tend to revise a lot, but an awful lot of it is letting things sit around while I stew over them. Those poems I just read, or have the I don't know what to call them, elegies, death poems, I'm still kind of working on. I was reading them partly to hear how they sounded, and I was improvising and changing a little bit as I went along in places, but I lost. So in that way, I'm still kind of refining. Sometimes you write something and it's done in a minute. Sometimes you write something that has something urgent in it and something that seems false, yada, 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 but you don't know what to do with it. And so, Al Ginsberg said, his theory, he supposedly said he got from Jack Kerouac, was first take, best take. Write it down and be done with it. Then you look at his writing, he actually revised quite a lot, but he was philosophically against revising. William Stafford, Bill Stafford, a wonderful poet of the Pacific Northwest, said he never touched a poem after 4 days because he thought he was a new person every 5th day. But I can have a poem sitting around for 2 years, mostly done, but I have a big file called Not Quite There Yet. And when I'm stuck, do I work every day? Sometimes it's just opening up that file. I also have a file that is done but not interesting. and sometimes I'll go into that file and think there's nothing. A lot of the done but not interesting are just reports of dreams in the last few years. But the thing about it is writing is that you don't know what's in you. You just don't. Either in terms of, not just in terms of content, but of shape. You want to write song-like poems. You want to write snarky, angular poems. You want to howl. You want to sing. And then, in what language, what content, how do you bring it doesn't have to be in poetry, we're symbol-making, pattern-making beings to the core of our being. It's like you can do it in the way you teach, or the way you dress, or the way you organize a room, but somehow you've got to find your way there. And with poetry, the way you do it, I think also with prose, is do it. And then revise if you can, or if you need to get nearer and nearer. The famous example of that is so instructive to me, right, London, right after the Napoleonic Wars, was supposedly just a hellhole. And William Blake, who had belonged to the upper classes, he was an artisan engraver who belonged to a kind of Baptist, weird Anabaptist church, and developed his weird visions. Wrote an angry poem that's one of the great political poems called London, and about the city. And Blake believed, this church he was in believed in free love, and they thought that the demand for chastity in women created prostitution and spread venereal disease. He was against war, he was for the liberation of women, he was for sexual freedom, a whole bunch of very strange things to be in favor of in 1800. And he wrote a poem called London that begins, I wandered down each dirty street, down where the dirty Thames does flow, and marked in every face I met, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every, it looks like you could recite it out loud. Anyway, his revision was to change the word dirty, because London was a city created by a charter. So he said, I wandered down each chartered street, down where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. And he turned kind of formless complaint into this focused anger, saying, this is a human order. This is, and later in the poem he says, in everywhere and everything, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Our lack of freedom, our lack of courage, it's in here. The mind-forged manacles that hold us back. And he articulated that, but it took him the second thought, the second try to do that. Anyway, thank you all.
Very, thank you.